emphasizes the need to do those things in order, the need to be baptized in order for salvation, the need to have those sacraments. There's a lot of form and ritual to religion, which William McKinley was about, like doing all of those things. I do not mean that he wasn't sincere about his faith. I think he was, but he was very religious in the sense that he kept wanting to do the right things. I don't know if you get the distinction I'm making. So he had a religious motivation for stuff, but one that was certainly guided by his concept that God had favored certain types of people, especially Anglo peoples, and that the other peoples of the world were backwards in part because they didn't have Christianity, and so they lived very, very differently. So it was dominated by dollars and Darwinism, definitely. Where Theodore Roosevelt, he was Darwinist in the sense, I don't know that he was Darwinist, he certainly believed that the peoples of the world were less than Americans. But that wasn't because they were other ethnicities, it was because they weren't American. If a Filipino was a Filipino-American, he would have all the time in the world for them. If they were a Filipino, he could care less because they weren't American. So, but it was also guided by the defense part, and that he wanted the U.S. to be the supreme power in the Western Hemisphere, and in his mind, a force for good and stability in the Western Hemisphere. He didn't really, it wasn't about economic concerns for him. He was no friend of American business, except that American business helped make the United States great, which he was very interested in. He was very patriotic. I mean that in a positive and a negative way, but it wasn't about dollars for him. Does that make sense? It was very strategic. And there was an element of Darwinism in it, in that he really didn't think that other people of the world had any right to say what should or shouldn't happen to their country. It was really irrelevant what they thought. They were dirty people from other countries anyway. They weren't Americans, so why bother with them? Where Wilson was like, no, all the peoples of the world have the right to determine for themselves what their government should be, and I won't even negotiate with a government that doesn't give its people the right of self-determination, and I will only support those governments who support their own people. So the D for him, I don't think he has a D, because it's definitely not dollars, and it's not the religious element. His thing is like almost a progressive foreign policy. I'm going to go around the world and make things right for all nations. First of all, I'm going to correct all our mistakes, but I'm also going to support countries in giving their people self-determination, which was harder to do than he imagined it would be. And then Taft wanted stability, but the way that he arrived at it was to encourage American business to invest in foreign countries. That was my thing in first period about dollar diplomacy. It's not economic. It does benefit business in that American businesses went into foreign countries and made huge profits by investing in there with the support of the U.S. Military and just overt support of the government. But the point for Taft was that if you put money into these countries, of course the money went to American businesses, then they would be stable, and then they wouldn't pose a threat to the defense of the United States. I think Taft was just a little more disengaged. Like Theodore Roosevelt, he stayed awake at night thinking about the world and foreign policy, as did Woodrow Wilson. Taft, it was like kind of low on his radar. It's just like, make those people happy in American business, go over there and we'll be good. He was worried about other things, like what was for breakfast. Thanks for laughing. Okay, anything else about question 8? Okay, for 9, you have to think about what was successful and what wasn't. And it would be easier to start with what wasn't successful. This is kind of a faulty question in a way because you don't know what happens after this and whether those reforms stay in place. And the United States lurches back to the era of McKinley in a way after the 1920s. They've had enough of progressivism in the 1920s. So they go back to, it's very, like as you're reading Gatsby, it's a very Gilded Age society. It's just like nouveau avant-garde Gilded Age. Men are thin instead of fat. Women all cut their hair short instead of being you know, putting on extra pounds and stuff. It's a new version of it, but it's a very similar mentality. But let's just cut it at 1920 and say that was the end of progressivism as it was. In what way did they, were they not successful? There's one group that is totally excluded from any of this progress. There you go. So mention that. And even though there were reformers like Du Bois and I have to do that every time, yes, and Booker T. Washington, they were totally excluded from economic progress, from social and political progress. Nothing happens in the South for African Americans. I guess there's a little more attention to the issue of lynching. That's it. Women don't see a lot of gain from the progressive movement, except that in 1920, finally, after many centuries of agitation, they do finally get the right to vote in national elections. So I don't know that there was a lot of, it kind of ignored the women's movement, and suffragists just kept bugging, especially President Wilson, like, how can you ignore something so obvious when you're so committed to, you know, that document we had where it's like, you have sympathy for the German people because of the way the Kaiser's treating them, which now makes more sense to you, I bet. But you don't have sympathy for American women who are oppressed by their own government. In what ways was it successful? And really a lot of that's in question 8. You just have to think of the successes. Here's some: 16th Amendment, 17th Amendment. I would include the 18th because I don't know if that was successful. I mean, it was successful in that they did theoretically end, well, they made illegal the consumption and production of alcohol. I don't know if you want to include that since it didn't end, and in the end was such a disaster that it was repealed by the 21st Amendment. But I guess at getting it passed, they were successful. They were successful at reforming the economic system. That's the 16th Amendment income tax. Wilson's establishment of the Federal Reserve, which regulated the currency supply and kept that inflation-deflation from being more severe than it was. The Federal Trade Commission, the regulation of banks. The government did a lot in the economic sector that balanced out the economy. They're going to abandon that in the 1920s, and there's going to be a new wave of buying things on credit and some things that happen with the stock market that will mess that up. Plus all the things that are supposed to oversee the government, no one's doing in the 20s, even though they're still there. What were the successes socially? I guess that this is kind of economic too. The concept that people like workers were a voice that should be heard, that the voice of average people, whether it's children, child labor, or workers, labor, anthracite, coal strike, that they were of equal value in American society and that they could not be ignored. And in a way, it sort of staved off social revolution in that reforms happened and cut down on the discontent. And so in some ways, it was successful at literally saving the United States, in that revolution that was coming, Coxey's Army, the political assassinations, it disappeared because prosperity came. Actually, prosperity came in 1900 anyway. Ironically, prosperity came before progressivism. The economy got better after McKinley was elected. And what other areas you could talk about with trust? They were very successful in regulating business, whether it's Roosevelt's trust-busting, Taft's trust-busting, or Wilson using the Clayton Antitrust Act to regulate trusts. They were successful in meeting some of the demands of labor, the Clayton Antitrust Act again, 8-hour workday for workers.
Food condition.
They were successful in protecting consumers, the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act. They were successful in changing the way that we see the federal government as an instrument for good. As David McCullough said in that video, Americans got the idea that it was a good thing to have a good man in that office that wanted to do good things for the United States. where before the ideal president had been someone who did nothing.